The 2021 Formula 1 season really doesn't get any calmer. Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes took a second straight victory in the Qatar Grand Prix and reduced the World Championship deficit to Max Verstappen to 8 points with just 2 races to go. But that relatively straightforward win came amid a backdrop of week-long arguments over F1 officiating, and in a race littered with punctures, and featuring a shock podium finisher who had last been on the Grand Prix rostrum 7 years ago. Just to underline what a weird weekend this was, Red Bull team boss Christian Horner even got a personal steward summons. Here's our selection of the real winners and losers from F1's first trip to Losail. Let's face it, the race winner is always going to appear in the happy section of these videos, but this felt like a particularly important victory for Lewis Hamilton. Just 2 weeks ago in Mexico, he looked in danger of losing touch with Verstappen in the battle for the Drivers' Championship. But a faultless drive in the inaugural Qatar Grand Prix, leading from pole position in what he described as a lonely race, means Hamilton is now just 8 points down in the standings. The Mercedes was certainly the fastest car, but Hamilton nailed the start and didn't put a foot wrong on his way to F1 victory number 102. That made it 2 wins in a row for Hamilton and Mercedes, who have hit top form at the perfect time in the season. From one Mercedes straight to the other. Remember when Mercedes boss Toto Wolff and Valtteri Bottas talked of how the Finn felt he needed more support over team radio a few months ago? Well, the very firm "come on Valtteri, get these cars" exhortation that Wolff gave Bottas in the early laps in Qatar, at a time when his Red Bull counterpart Sergio Perez was hacking his way through the midfield easily and Bottas conspicuously wasn't, was more an exasperated telling off than inspirational encouragement. And at that point, this felt like another one of those Bottas races where something goes wrong early on and he vanishes for the rest of the Grand Prix. But this time Bottas appeared set to rescue the situation, put that poor first lap behind him and potentially salvage a podium from a race where he'd ended the first lap only 11th. At least until he became the first puncture victim, and eventually had to retire as a result. This might be a contentious selection, given Verstappen couldn't match title rival Hamilton all weekend, and is now under even bigger pressure in the championship. But Hamilton's pace meant this was a weekend where Verstappen couldn't realistically aspire to win unless he had a huge slice of luck. Throw in the penalty that demoted him to 7th on the grid, and this was, as Red Bull team principal Christian Horner described it, an outstanding piece of damage limitation. Up to 4th at the start, despite being briefly squeezed off by Fernando Alonso, Verstappen soon passed Pierre Gasly for 3rd when the AlphaTauri was slow onto the straight, and then they grabbed 2nd from Alonso with a DRS pass on lap 5. By then, he was 4 seconds behind leader Hamilton and could do nothing to close the gap, which gradually extended as the race progressed. The late virtual safety car allowed Verstappen to pit for softs and set fastest lap on the last lap, although he would have had the bonus point for that even if he hadn't done so. For the second weekend in a row, fans went to sleep after qualifying not knowing what the actual starting order for the race would be. As with the investigation into Hamilton's rear wing post-qualifying in Brazil, the FIA took far too long to decide on the potential yellow flag rule breaches by Verstappen, Bottas and Carlos Sainz in qualifying in Qatar. Just 90 minutes before the Grand Prix is not the right time for a crucial twist in the championship tale to be announced. Verstappen's incident was made all the worse by the mixed messages coming from the FIA during the closing stages of Q3, when there was a confusing mixture of all clear, single waved yellows, double waved yellows, and no dashboard or GPS warnings in the moments following puncture-stricken Pierre Gasly grinding to a halt. Christian Horner's comments surrounding that incident earned him a summons to face the FIA stewards, and he apologised for the remarks about the FIA and the marshalling. They were over the line, but the roots of his frustration do hold some weight, and it all followed the controversial handling of Verstappen and Hamilton's Brazilian Grand Prix incident. The debate over Mercedes' rejected bid for a review of that clash had dominated the start of the Qatar weekend. A much anticipated drivers' briefing on Friday night at Losail only led to disappointment and bewilderment from the majority of drivers, who felt no closer than knowing what is and isn't allowed in wheel-to-wheel combat. A total of 2,675 days since he last stood on an F1 podium for Ferrari in the 2014 Hungarian Grand Prix, Alonso returned to the rostrum with a superb drive to 3rd place in Qatar. From the start of the weekend, he loved the Losail circuit, describing it as fantastic and saying he could drive around it all night. He converted that into 5th in qualifying, which turned into 3rd on the grid thanks to penalties, and then a brief spell in 2nd place after overtaking Gasly on the first lap. Inevitably, he was soon passed by Verstappen, but with Alpine confident about the wear rate of the troublesome front left Pirelli, Alonso committed to a one-stop strategy. Though Sergio Perez overtook him during that stint, the Red Bull driver had to two-stop, so Alonso was back up to 3rd. Alonso's pace then held up well, and he was able to stay ahead by just under 3 seconds as Perez charged back towards him. Combined with Bottas' puncture, gave Alonso his long-awaited podium return. Before we hit our next loser, a massive thank you to everybody who has already subscribed to our channel. We really do massively appreciate it and are loving having you all along for the ride with us through this epic season. If you haven't subscribed yet and you want to make sure you're not missing out on any of our content through the final weeks of this mad title fight, please do hit that button. The two-stop strategy AlphaTauri committed to early on with both its cars looked like a mistake at the time. Even the punches the one-stoppers suffered didn't really change that. It's probably no coincidence that the only cars that could really afford to get away with two-stopping without losing places were the Mercedes and Red Bull that were escaping into the distance out front. But then again, regardless of strategy, it's not like the AlphaTauri looked even a little bit fast in race trim. So even if front row starter Gasly's suboptimal early pit stop was simply an overreaction to his lack of pace, it's hard to imagine AlphaTauri would have got much more out of this race by one-stopping. Gasly, after all, came up behind Sebastian Vettel on fresher mediums in the end, yet wound up finishing over 5 seconds off the Aston Martin as second on the grid became 11th at the end of the race. The pace was just not there, and given the track proved more conducive to overtaking than expected, there's not much you can do about a fundamental lack of lap time. With Alpine scoring 25 points to draw 25 points clear, AlphaTauri's chance of 5th place in the Constructors' Championship probably ended in this race, which had promised so much when it began. Both Aston Martin and Lance Stroll needed this 6th place. The team had been effectively cut adrift of any sort of meaningful battle in the Constructors' Championship, and Stroll had contributed to that by scoring just 2 points in the past 5 races. Even on Saturday in 3rd practice, Stroll was loudly and swearily exclaiming about how bad his car was over team radio. So in that context, 6th place with a gutsy, competitive drive from 11th on the grid was a refreshing result for the Canadian, who is now a much more respectable 9 points off teammate Sebastian Vettel. Vettel himself, though only 10th, will also be pleased with his recovery drive, considering he got stuck behind Bottas and then forced out wide at the first corner. Daniel Ricciardo's pointless streak extends to 3 races after a fairly anonymous Qatar Grand Prix where he had no answer for the pace of his McLaren teammate Lando Norris. For whatever reason, Ricciardo struggled all the weekend at Losail, describing himself on Saturday as handcuffed in how he could drive the McLaren through some of the long corners. In the race, Ricciardo had to do some bizarre extreme fuel saving due to fuel warning messages that would later prove to be incorrect. It all left him 12th at the checkered flag, over 30 seconds behind Norris despite his teammate suffering a puncture. This recent semi-slump is a shame to see after Ricciardo's post-summer breakthrough promised so much, and initially delivered a lot in the shape of his Monza win. The F1 drivers were enthusiastic about the challenge of the Losail circuit from the start of practice, but they were also predicting the race would be a total procession, as all those medium speed and fast corners would mean they couldn't follow each other closely. And yet when it came to race day, Losail really worked for F1. There was no shortage of overtaking, and while plenty of those passes were of the routine DRS variety, there was some proper wheel-to-wheel action both into the Turn 1 braking zone and completely removed from the DRS zone altogether. The track is never going to be an evocative F1 classic bursting with atmosphere. It's quite easy to mistake for Bahrain, and you're never going to confuse it with Spa. As a MotoGP venue, it has 2 unique selling points of being the season opener and a rare night race, but neither of those apply for F1. But Losail, of course, is a stopgap venue before Qatar establishes its own all-new purpose-built F1 circuit. So even if this track doesn't make many appearances on the calendar, it's at least generated pretty good racing at the first attempt. Ferrari was in the losers section when we first dropped the draft list for this video, and it initially stayed there even when Norris's puncture meant Ferrari wasn't going to be outscored by its main Constructors' Championship rival McLaren after all. Our debate got quite feisty in our virtual office. Was this a bad day for Ferrari because it was so far off the pace, or a good day because of what the result meant for its championship position? In the end, we settled on the latter, so it's on the winners list. Ferrari might not be losing much sleep over the fact it only finished 7th and 8th in Qatar. Its 2 one-stopping cars kept their tyres alive and salvaged a result on the weekend when the team had to do an overnight chassis change for Leclerc after a crack was found following qualifying. Norris's puncture and Ricciardo's poor race mean Ferrari is now 39.5 points up on McLaren in the battle for 3rd in the Constructors' standings. For all intents and purposes, that's game over. But the Ferrari's performance was nothing to write home about, and it can't be too reassuring that even after its recent engine upgrade, it was being shown up by Alpines, Aston Martins and McLarens in Qatar. Yes, this generation of F1 cars is history in 2 races' time, but finishing 80 seconds behind the winner with both cars doesn't inspire a huge amount of confidence about the Ferrari design team. So that's our list of who really should be delighted or downcast at the end of the Losail weekend. Please do let us know what you think of our choices and who you would have picked instead.